income housing tax credit, representing all parts of the affordable housing industry. And I'm joined here by several of the people that I advocate with every day for affordable housing. So I will run through their names and organizations, but then let them tell you a little bit more about themselves. So I'm joined by Jennifer Schwartz with the National Council of State Housing Agencies, Shannon Ross with the Housing Partnership Network, and Margaret Salazar with the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. So I'll let them introduce themselves, and let's start with you, Jennifer.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily and Sadie. I really appreciate being asked to be here today. I'm really excited to learn more about WAHN. I will admit that I was not familiar with this organization before Emily asked me to be on this panel, and I think it's really exciting to have this kind of forum for women in the affordable housing industry to support each other and mentor each other. And I'm just really grateful to have been asked to be part of this. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Schwartz with the National Council of State Housing Agencies. NCSHA is the national trade association that represents state housing finance agencies like Oregon Housing and Community Services. So I'm really excited to have Margaret here on this panel. She's my Oregon member. I do a lot of work for NCSHA in regards to advocacy around the low-income housing tax credit program, bonds. I also oversee our work on appropriations and HUD programs. So pretty much everything on the multifamily front for the most part, although with neighborhood homes investment credit coming our way at some point soon, hopefully, fingers crossed, I might be getting more onto the single family side of the world as well. And then, of course, this last year, I have been very focused on the implementation of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which I know we'll touch on during the session. So thank you all for having me.
Great. And well, I guess maybe everyone's Zoom tiles are different than mine, but Shannon is next in order for me. So Shannon, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and thanks, Sadie. I echo Jennifer's excitement to be here and join WAHN today to talk about the policy update. And as Emily previewed, lots of exciting things to talk about this year in particular. So I work with the Housing Partnership Network. We're a national network of affordable housing nonprofits. So probably in your community, I'm sure most of these people on the phone either work for one or with a lot of our members, but our members are multifamily developers, operators, syndicators, but also lenders with CDFIs and single family developers and lenders as well. So we kind of do the whole spectrum of affordable housing needs and development. So I'm looking forward to talking to you guys today about what we see on the horizon.
Great. And Margaret?
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. And thank you so much also for the invitation. So I run Oregon Housing Community Services Department. We are the state housing finance agency, but we also work all across the housing continuum as part of state government here. And so everything from homeless services and energy assistance all the way through homeownership programs, and increasingly crisis response programs and disaster response and recovery. So a lot going on at the state and local level, and happy to talk about policy as well as implementation. Maybe just a quick note, if you're not muted, if you wouldn't mind muting, we're getting a little bit of feedback here. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, as you can see, this is a great group of fellow panelists and a lot to talk about. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about Build Back Better, which is, of course, the potentially most historic investment in affordable housing ever and may be on the president's desk within the next couple of weeks or not. But we'll also talk about some of the other issues in the affordable housing world, and feel free to just ask us any questions in the chat as we go. Happy to take what we can, and should be a great conversation. So wanted to just start a little bit by setting the stage. Don't want to assume everyone has been following as closely as we have the intricacies of the dual track infrastructure process. So this may be old news for some of you, but if you'll bear with me. So you may remember that the main initiative after we got through COVID relief when the Biden administration came in was to invest in our nation's infrastructure, which is something that administrations have been talking about for many years at this point. And it broke into a two-track process into the kind of hard traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges, and into the human infrastructure priorities. So the traditional infrastructure is what became the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which has already passed. It's been signed into law, and they're kind of beginning the tour of going around the country and showing what sorts of investments are going to be made from the bipartisan infrastructure deal. Then there's Build Back Better, which is not bipartisan. It's Democrats only. It's going to be using the budget reconciliation process, which is the tool that a party that has a majority, thin as it may be, can use to pass legislation with only a simple majority rather than the 60 votes you normally need in the Senate. So they're working on trying to get this human infrastructure reconciliation bill to the president's desk before the end of the year. And obviously the hours are ticking by very quickly here. So this second bill, which has not yet passed and which they're still negotiating, is the one where we are looking at potentially $150 billion in new resources for HUD programs, biggest expansion and really significant improvements to low-income housing tax credit, and some new initiatives like neighborhood homes. So that's just kind of the two tracks that we're on right now, and wanted to spend a little more time kind of going through where we are with that before we start diving into some of the nuts and bolts of what's in it for housing. So Shannon, can you kick us off by, even though there wasn't housing in the bill that's passed already, what was in there that might be of interest to the housing community?
Great. Yes, absolutely. So Emily said, well, that there is this large bill that has become law. So we're out of the speculative stage and into more of the implementation stage with this set of programs. And it is, as Emily said, more traditional infrastructure. It was an investment between 1.2 trillion at the top end, depending on how you count investment, and at least 550 billion of new money. So it's a large investment, particularly on top of all the COVID bills we've seen in the last couple of years. And the top line you hear about is things like roads, bridges, airports, kind of the traditional, consensus view of what is infrastructure. But there's a lot in the built communities, for built communities, that I think should be of interest to people who work in affordable housing. The first and kind of maybe the most on point is a pilot program at the Department of Transportation called Reconnecting Communities. And this is a program aimed at undoing the racial inequities that were caused by putting, for example, a highway through a neighborhood and cutting off majority minority community from opportunity and jobs in the rest of the city. We see that over and over again. So it's $1 billion grant program, and looking at discriminating highway plans and other things. So I think that'll be interesting to see where that goes. There is more money for that in Build Back Better. So if it takes off and if we get that money, it could be a larger thing. Another area of interest to those of us who care about affordable housing access is broadband access expansion. So it made permanent a federal program that was created for COVID relief. It made some changes, but it's called the Affordable Connectivity Program that'll help low-income families access the internet with some subsidy. It also created a broadband equity access and deployment program to provide funding for states and help bridge the digital divide. So really some real resources behind broadband access. There's also water infrastructure improvement, which is aimed at both lead pipes, but also service lines, water contamination. So that will, be coming out. Additional funding for the weatherization assistance program. So more money for, people in extreme weather states, which unfortunately is increasing all of us, to make improvements and upgrades to homes. The public transit portion, again, not directly housing, but does have language in it of focusing the public transit dollars in coordination with housing plans, so that we should watch and see how that plays out. And then finally, updates to the electrical grid. So obviously, we all live in electrified, or most of us live in electrified homes. So it's going to be important to see how that that plays out and what we can see improvements there.
Right, so as you can see, a lot of programs of interest, even if not direct housing investments. So thank you, Shannon. Jennifer, turning over to you. So we're at the point now where the House passed its version of Build Back Better before Thanksgiving, and the Senate is now trying to do everything possible to move this, even though The Senate has a whole lot of hurdles that the House doesn't necessarily have. So we're expecting to see some more pieces of the Senate bill come out, maybe even later today, some over the next few days. But the House bill had the biggest investment in the housing credit ever, about $12 billion worth of resources, a lot of new, a lot of provisions that would really all the provisions we've been advocating for several years that would actually really have the most production impact from the whole set of proposals. So can you give an overview of what was in the House bill and for the credit and what we expect to see in the Senate bill?
Great. So I was in a meeting yesterday, and one of the people who I think, would not say this if it were not true, although I have not done the math itself, said that this bill is actually bigger than the New Deal and the Great Society put together, adjusted for inflation. So just to put this in perspective as to how historic an investment this really is. If he's wrong about that, please don't hold me accountable. But wow, that just blew me away. The housing credit piece is, as Emily just said, just under $12 billion, which is actually a small piece of the overall bill. However, it has such an amazing potential for really increasing supply, which I think is where so many of us have for such a long time just known that supply is one of the biggest challenges that we face in affordable housing. And Novogradac has looked at all of these different provisions and added them all together. And the supply provisions for the housing credit would create over 800,000 additional homes over a 10-year period of time. And that's huge. So let's break that down a little bit and look at what's actually in the House bill and what's contributing to that big increase in supply that we're looking at. So first of all, the biggest piece of that supply increase is actually by a provision that lowers the bond financing threshold from 50% down to 25%. This is really exciting. We are seeing more and more states that are bond cap constrained. And that means that their 4% credit programs are getting competitive. They don't have enough bond cap to meet the demand that they have for 4% credits. And we know that this has been even exacerbated over the last year because we were successful in getting the 4% minimum rate at the end of the year last year. And that has put even more pressure on states like Oregon and so many others that are running out of bond cap or have already run out of bond cap. By making this tiny tweak, in the language and changing that threshold from 50% to 25%, we're effectively doubling what we're able to do with the 4% credit. And if you look at the last few years, it used to be that the 4% credit made up about 40% of production, 50% of production. Now, the 4% credit is actually leading production in the housing credit program over the 9% program, which has been a really interesting thing. We're going to see that change and be even more so in the future with the slower 50% test. So that only goes through 2026. It is not a permanent change in the tax code, but it has a huge possibility to increase housing production. So that's one piece. The next piece, of course, is a cap increase. So on the 9% side, we desperately need more of those resources because those are the resources where we have the greater subsidy and can do more permanent supportive housing and housing that really needs more resources, more equity than the 4% credit is able to bring to bear. So the House bill has a stepped up increase in the housing credit cap. It is a temporary increase. It goes up effectively, it's a 10% increase each year. So 10% increase over current levels in 2022, 10% more, so a 20% increase in 2023, and 10% more in 2024, bringing us up to a 30% increase. But there are also what had been inflation adjustments in between each of those years. Not inflation anymore because inflation ends up being higher than we thought it was going to be at the time that we were putting together these numbers. But overall, that's about a 41% increase in the housing credit as of 2024. The problem is that in 2025, this would go all the way back down, not just to where we are now, but actually where we were prior to the 12.5% increase that we got in 2018 on a temporary basis. And we have real concerns about having the cap increase expire in 2024. 2024 is a presidential election year. There are no other tax extenders that are expiring in 2024. And usually what we try to do would be to we'd be one of many tax extenders. We want to be able to jump on a train and move and continue that expansion of the housing credit moving forward. The problem is there is no train in 2024. We would be the train, and that is a difficult thing. So we've been talking to our colleagues on the Senate side and the House, because they're very aware of this problem, about the possibility of not having that kind of stepped in increase through 2024, but actually being able to extend this cap increase through 2025. So it would be lower in the first few years than we would get under the House language, go way up in 2024, so that the extension would come, in 2025, so that the extension would be at that point. And that in 2025, there are a whole bunch of things that are expiring, which would put us in a much better position for moving forward and trying to get an extension to the housing credit cap increase. So that's one of the things that we think may change between the House and the Senate bills, and also really critical. A couple other things that are in the bill. There is an extremely low income basis boost and set aside. It's a really complicated provision, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A, but I don't want to get into all the details of that right now. There is a basis boost for housing credit properties in Indian areas. There is a change that would allow developers to take advantage of the investment tax credit, which is primarily a solar tax credit with housing credit properties without a reduction in basis, which is pretty exciting for us. And then NCSHA is very supportive of a couple of provisions in the bill that would help on the preservation side for housing credit properties, one around closing the qualified contract loophole, and the other around protecting nonprofits that want to exercise their right of first refusal at year 15. So these are all things that are in the bill. We're super excited about it.
And Jennifer, can you speak a little bit to, you mentioned we may see some changes on the cap increase, but generally speaking, we are expecting all of these housing credit provisions to be in the final Senate bill?
Yes, we do not think that the housing credit production provisions are going to be taken out. I think that, the biggest danger from my perspective is that the two preservation provisions around qualified contracts and right of first refusal may be more susceptible to what we call the Byrd rule, which is one of the special rules for reconciliation. That means that certain things don't fit into this special reconciliation bill that can pass the Senate with just a bare majority. So one of the things that's happening right now is the parliamentarian is working with senators on both sides of the aisle as they make their arguments about what can and what can't be included in the final bill under these rules. And we are very hopeful and cautiously optimistic that we will be able to retain these two provisions. But I think those are the ones that are most in danger under those Senate rules.
Yeah, and again, this is something we should know in the next few days. They're going through the process now, so the suspense will hopefully, at least on this front, not be long. So yes, I echo Jennifer. We're very excited about what's in there for the housing credit. A lot of other housing resources as well. So Shannon, can you give an overview of what's in there for the HUD and the banking committee programs?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Emily said at the outset, we might have the Senate numbers for these programs today. So banking is one of the ones we might know today. So this is what passed out of the House. These are not final numbers, but we'll know more as the days go on. But it's $150 billion in investment, primarily through HUD, for affordable housing, not in the tax code. So in addition to what Jennifer just outlined for production programs through the housing credit, But the biggest ticket item in the bill is $65 billion with a B dollars for public housing repairs. This, as you may imagine, is a top priority for Majority Leader Schumer. NYCHA is in his footprint, and the backlog of repairs on their portfolio and other public housing agencies is well documented. So that is the largest chunk, but then there's a lot for a lot of other things. So there's $25 billion for new rental assistance, including $1 billion of that will be for project-based rental assistance, which I know is of particular interest to Housing Partnership Network members. $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, $10 billion for home, $10 billion for a new program that would be aimed or would provide down payment assistance for first-generation home buyers. $3 billion for another new program at HUD called the Community Restoration and Revitalization Fund. And that has a lot of uses. It can be used for community land banks. It can be used for community assets like community centers or childcare. It can also be used with distressed properties, single family homes in certain neighborhoods. And that's defined by the qualified census tract, or certain census tracts are allowed for that. 1.8 billion for a new program called the Unlocking Possibilities Program, which would be out of HUD, but would focus on zoning and land use, which I think would be interesting to see where that went, given that, obviously zoning and land use is a local issue. And so how HUD will use that money and what kind of carrots and sticks might come out of that. 750 million for a new program called the Housing Investment Fund. Now this one is modeled after the Capital Magnet Fund. And because of the rules that both Jennifer and Emily mentioned, and what can be included in this bill, Congress couldn't make the changes they wanted to make to the Capital Magnet Fund through this bill. So they're making a new program, basically saying start as if it's Capital Magnet Fund. So we have a little better idea what that would be used for. And that's a competitive grant program right out of Treasury Department. And you're probably familiar with it. It's a magnet program, and that the capital will attract money like a magnet, and it's supposed to be leveraged. So 750 million for that program and leverage. 500 million for HUD 811 and new HUD 811, and 500 million for new HUD 202. So it's just, a lot of the programs that affordable housing advocates have been wanting for a long time, with pretty substantial investments coming out of the House and hopefully the Senate as well.
Yeah, and one last program we wanted to flag that was in the House version and likely in the Senate version is the neighborhood homes tax credit. So Shannon, can you give a quick overview of this new tax program?
Yes, absolutely. And this is kind of, again, it's focused at single family or small 1 to 4s. And so it's meant to be a complement to the housing credit. And it's really looking at how you fill the gap between what it costs to build or renovate a home and what it can be appraised and sold for. Because, a lot of communities, particularly older, communities that have lost population, although you find this, I'm from Baltimore, there's parts of Baltimore that this would be really useful in, where there just hasn't been investment in the housing stock, but for a relatively modest subsidy, you can get a family in the home and have it be home ownership. They need to be owner occupied. And it would be run, as Jennifer said, out of the state agencies and competitively awarded to developers. So it's another tax credit, but we're really excited about the potential for that to be, like I said, a single family complement to the low-income housing tax credit.
Great. So Margaret, obviously a lot of resources and new programs potentially coming your way, and you're already trying to work through a lot of the resources that have been deployed this year. So what are you most excited about, and how do you see all of these programs fitting into your ability to build and preserve affordable housing?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is such an exciting moment to have this level of investment coming in. So I think one of the things that state agencies are really excited about is that the LIHTC provisions appear to be included at this time, which is really important. I think one of the things that we've been trying to educate lawmakers about is, the investments in things like the Housing Trust Fund and public housing and home are so important, but on the ground, we leverage all of that with LIHTC. So without LIHTC as the engine, we are not going to be able to deploy all of those other resources. And I think that's a really important message for us to continue to carry. One really specific thing Jennifer touched on is the 4% LIHTC program. just a few years ago, I think that the lament throughout the nation was what an underutilized resource that was. I know in our state, we just, we're so frustrated that we saw 4% credits kind of left on the table and all of that investment going to other states that could be coming into our small state. And we have made a huge effort to try to streamline our 4% application, to try to make it a more user-friendly program. And then really our state and local governments have stepped up with local bond resources that we're pairing with the 4% tax credit. It's been a very successful model. I think we're seeing that take off nationally. And sort of the tragedy that we're hitting that bond cap is just very frustrating, because we found a formula that's working. Even in rural communities, we're using 4% bond transactions. So that 50% test shift to the 25% test will be huge for our state. So that's something that we're laser focused on. And I believe there are 20 states now nationally that are in that same boat around being bond cap constrained. And that also affects our ability to originate mortgages, because many of us fund our mortgage, single family mortgage programs with private activity bonds. So being able to stretch that further on the multifamily side will be a win-win. So that's a really important feature for us, is sort of layering that together, not just for new construction, but also for preservation, and thinking about, again, the investments in public housing. If we can leverage that with 4% credits, that will be huge. And then the other piece that we're really excited about are the provisions on homeownership. So the Neighborhood Homes Improvement Act, which we just heard about, is a new LIHTC style-ish program for homeownership supply. And that's something that our advocates here in Oregon are looking at in terms of building generational wealth and really advancing our equity and racial justice goals. And HFAs around the country are increasingly talking about homeownership supply. So to have a federal tool that we can work with and we can wrap around with state and local resources would be really, really exciting for us. And then, of course, the emphasis on down payment assistance to be able to help families move up and out of rental housing. We think about that as really helping two families. You're helping that family achieve home ownership, and then you're also helping that next family who has a space in a rental home and potentially an affordable rental home. So those are a couple of the things that we're most excited about as we look ahead. But pairing LIHTC with those gap funds, I think, is a message we need to continue to hit as an industry.
Yeah, it's a great point. And for those of you who are following this process, you'll remember painfully that there was about a week there when there was a version of the bill that included all of the programs we mentioned, except for the tax credits. All of the tax credits had been pulled out of the bill, or the community development tax credits, before they were added back in. And that point that you made, Margaret, about how all of these programs work together so closely, and we can't really have these enormous investments on the spending side without LIHTC is so important. So wanted to kind of pivot to advocacy, and this is going to be my last question on Build Back Better before we switch to some other topics. So if anyone in the audience has any questions about anything from Build Back Better, now would be a great time to put them in the chat. Wanted to see if, kind of given where we are in the process in these final stages here, what sort of advocacy is needed, and also feel free to touch on how did we get to this point where we were able to get so much support for housing, and also what do we do after this? So who wants to start? Actually, maybe Margaret, if I can put you on the spot, since you have the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee who's been really fighting for affordable housing, maybe you can get your perspective on building that support.
Absolutely. Yeah, Senator Wyden has been such a wonderful champion for us here. And, we're lucky in Oregon that both of our U.S. senators are housers through and through. So that is a wonderful thing. Of course, Senator Merkley's background is with Habitat for Humanity. So we're very, very blessed here with our elected officials. I think that giving those specific examples, I know right now we're able to, because we just hit our bond cap here in Oregon this year. And so we are literally programming our funding for 2022 and having to have two scenarios, one if Build Back Better passes and one if it doesn't. And we have a specific now survey of projects that we literally could not fund next year if this doesn't pass. And so those specifics of transactions that are in the hopper, that are ready to go, that if we don't get an increase in 9% credits, and if we don't get the 4% 50% test change, we can't fund those, I think is a really important message. Those specific, it's really hard for folks, nebulously, like if you cut a number in a program for hypothetical deals, that's a lot harder for people to get behind. But thinking about those actual transactions with those trusted partners in their home districts is what really gets people motivated. But I wanted to say, because I'm in my chair as an implementer, and boy, is the heat on implementers right now, I would just say a couple of other things. I think the other thing that we can do as an industry is have really good, hard, candid conversations with each other about getting ready to implement. And I know I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I don't want to jinx the process. But at the same time, we're going to need to be ready to go on day one with all of these new resources and even the infrastructure resources. And that means working with your networks nationally, but also in your home communities around the real conversations on capacity, because everyone from small grassroots nonprofits to affordable housing developers to certainly our partners in the finance industry to folks that are delivering services, everyone is really tapped to the hilt right now. And so thinking creatively about those other partners and sectors that we might bring to the table, philanthropy, other kinds of soft funders that we might be able to get to the table to help us launch these programs successfully is going to be really important. So I don't want us to forget about that very real implementation and capacity piece that's in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mark,
So,
I think I think that's such an important message to get out there. We may be given this once in multi-generations opportunity to really make huge changes in the affordable housing system, and we cannot drop this ball. And it's hard because we're already so stretched, and there have been amazing resources that we've been able to achieve, and this is all good news. But we know that everybody has been working 24/7 on the regular legacy programs, but also these new programs that we've gotten with homeowner assistance fund and the emergency rental assistance program and so many other things that are going on. This is going to be a huge test of the industry as a whole, and we need to not fight each other and support each other in running these programs and making sure that we're successful. I think that's really important. The other thing I just wanted to say is that I would encourage everybody to be in contact with their members of Congress. First of all, not just their senators, since even though this is over at the Senate, but also their House members, thanking their House members for what they did, because the fact that we got this out of the House with such an amazing result is huge. Please be making those calls to thank them and reminding them that this is going to be coming back to them, that we're going to, assuming that the Senate passes this, we are going to need the House to then act again to pass it, the final version, what the Senate ends up passing. And then also to be in contact with your senators, letting them know how important it is that this bill gets done. There's a lot of questions about when it's going to happen, and a lot of that is outside of the housing world, but making sure that they know just how important it is that that this bill, that we get over the finish line.
Yeah, and Emily, not to get back to your first question, which I think is what Jennifer ended on and Margaret started with, is the advocacy now. I think what we outlined at the beginning of this conversation is pretty much cooked. There's some things we're debating around the edges. Jennifer, I think, mentioned some in the tax space, and like I said, we'll look and see what comes out of the Senate today for the HUD provisions, and either for procedural reasons or for kind of industry tweaks, there might be small changes, but at this point, it really is going to kind of rise and fall together, the Build Back Better. You might see provisions fall out, you might see them stay in, but it's going to be one vote. It's not going to be a vote on individuals. So I think when we the message really is, please support this bill because of all the things that are in housing. And I think that's something the industry's been really good at, really stay together on message of, we might all have different favorite programs, but that housing investment is just crucial to all the other things we're trying to do in the healthy communities Congress and the administration are trying to build, and keeping that up. And I do want to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane about how we got here. And I think this is a sustained effort over I mean, I am probably the newest to this issue on this call, and I've been at it for almost 7 years. So, we've all been working on it for a long time and built those coalitions. I think that's the kind of energy and effort we're going to need to make some of these newer programs to succeed as well. So kind of that, combined effort and really over time building those relationships and really working with policymakers to make sure they work.
Yeah, and I'm just going to use a moderator's prerogative here and also emphasize that while it's really important to thank and keep nudging all of the Democrats who've supported these programs in reconciliation, we have a very long history of bipartisan support. And of course, Republicans haven't been part of this process because it's been clear from the get-go that, they broke off the Democratic priorities for this. But, we have certainly no assurances that the political landscape we have now is going to remain. And as soon as we get through this process, or even before, if you're meeting with members of Congress, you're represented by Republicans, to just make sure that, even if the way we get some of these investments across the finish line is with Democratic only support, that we, don't for a second jeopardize the bipartisan support for these programs, and thank everyone who supported them along the way and let them know we appreciate them as well. So switching gears, obviously a lot of news, a lot of money potentially in the next couple of weeks, but we also have our usual annual keeping the government running budget appropriations process. So Shannon, can you give us an update on where we are in that?
Yes. So as Emily noted, we're in fiscal year 2022. That started October 1st, but we're still under a continuing resolution, an extension of last year's spending plan. And the most recent extension of that happened last week. I've lost time already, but last week, and has extended it through mid-February to February 18th. So government will be funded same levels. We're not looking at a shutdown around Christmas, but there's not the anomalies or, kind of increases or decreases that reflect the policies of the current Congress in there now. Republicans are needed to support that under the current process they're going through. So, I find it difficult to think what would change between now and February that would get Republicans on board, but there are ongoing talks that there might be an agreement on spending limits, and we might see something in February for ongoing 2022. The other thing I will note that I often gets tied together, although it's different, is the debt limit. You probably heard in the news that we're creeping up against the debt limit. Again, Secretary Yellen has said that we have enough money until the 15th of December, so a week from today. That's not a drop dead deadline. It's vague on what would happen. It depends on corporate tax receipts and other things. But it looks like there may be a deal afoot now to also raise that. So the Republicans will let the Democrats do it alone, basically. So they won't help, but they also won't stand in the way. So which is help in and of itself. So it looks like we're in smooth sailing, but still operating on a CR.
All right, so a couple fewer things to worry about. So Margaret, we're coming off of a year where we've already seen a lot of other investments in affordable housing programs with tens of billions of dollars for emergency rental assistance deployed in a couple of chunks in response to the pandemic. So can you fill us in on Oregon's experience administering ERA?
Sure, Emily, and I could take a whole panel just on this, but I'll be brief. So, I mean, I think again, the recognition that rental assistance and eviction prevention is a critical piece of this response and recovery is wonderful, and I think that's been a real awakening in a lot of communities across the country. So, Oregon has been administering emergency rental assistance. We also administered state rental assistance in a number of programs that were rolled out. We're proud that Oregon is number 6 nationally in deploying emergency rental assistance. In addition to the ERA program, we also administered $200 million in state rental assistance. So this year we've put out $360 million in rental assistance so far in a state where our typical year was $17 million in rental assistance. So that just, I think, illustrates the task of building out this entirely new infrastructure building the plane while we're flying it, and really the work that required to get that done. So I think the recognition that we've had is that a couple things. One, there was just a staggering latent need for rental assistance that I think COVID just uncovered. And it's not surprising. In our state, we had 37% of all renters were severely housing cost burdened, so paying more than 50% of their income on rent before the pandemic. 37% of all renters, not extremely low income renters, all renters. That is really astonishing. And so what we're seeing is just this huge wall of need come in. Kind of once the application opened, just a real flood of need come in, and which is just, I think none of us are surprised, but I think maybe the public is a little bit surprised to see that all come in. And so building out that infrastructure, I think, has been really important, and doing it quickly. And so we're proud of how quickly we've done that. I think one of the things we had to do was pivot away from our typical delivery system of rental assistance, which was through local partners, and realize that they just didn't have the capacity to cut it at this pace, at this scale. And I would say, in talking to my colleagues from other states, they've had a similar experience where we typically deliver this rental assistance through small nonprofits that have relationships with landlords and tenants, and they do that case management. And that's really important. But at this speed and scale, we all had to pivot away from that in many cases and build something new. And so I think the question in front of us is, as many of us are, our application intake is now closed because we're fully subscribed for ERA. What comes next? So our governor has actually called a special legislative session for next Monday, and they're negotiating a package to strengthen eviction protections and add money to ERA, state dollars, and then think about what the off-ramp is, because there's a recognition, again, that we didn't solve the housing crisis with ERA. That was a one-time resource. But there's now an understanding that evictions for non-payment of rent are unpalatable, and that we need an eviction prevention system. So trying to figure out how to invest in that long-term is, I think, the question on the table that is on the table in Oregon, and I think starting to become something folks are waking up to nationally as well.
So Jennifer, you mentioned that you've been spending a lot of time on ERA as well. So in addition to that, what are some of the other issues before Treasury, IRS, HUD that you're looking at that could impact affordable housing?
So before I answer that question, I just want to pivot a little bit off of what Margaret was just saying about the ERA program. I know there's been a lot of press about the ERA program, that money wasn't going out fast enough. What you just heard Margaret say is that she has gone through all of her federal ERA resources, not just the first set of funds, but the second set as well, that her program is closed. And I think we're hearing this from other grantees as well. This program, I think, has been unfairly maligned in the press. It was a huge undertaking for grantees to set up a completely new infrastructure with $46 billion of funds. That's, look at HUD's budget on an annual basis. I mean, that's almost as much as HUD's entire annual budget. This program has been a huge success. And, where there have been challenges has really had to do with the formula that was used to distribute the funds. We are in the process right now of a reallocation, which is not about punishing states that didn't spend as much money. It's about right-sizing the allocations, because some states got more than what they needed and others got less than what they needed. And, the fact is, if this money had been distributed in, according to need, and we had had a magic ball to know exactly how much every grantee needed, we probably wouldn't have had enough money overall anyway. But we need to now move this money around so that it gets to the grantees that are able to spend it and have that huge demand. But this has been one of the most rewarding and important things that I've worked on in my life. And I really think the program itself has been a huge success. So now moving to Emily's question about what else is going on with IRS and HUD and Treasury. There is so much on the regulatory side. Quickly on HUD, one of the things I just want to bring up is, there is a $5 billion program, which in any other world would be huge, but the Home ARP program. So this was funding for homelessness prevention and services that was moved, that goes through the home program, and it was authorized as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. It has, because so much has been going on, I think it's really been overshadowed, but it is a really exciting program for all of us because this money, first of all, it can be used not just for development of affordable housing, but also for supportive services and for operating assistance. It could be used for the construction of non-congregate shelters. So all of those things are really important things. We always hear about the fact that service funding is not consistent with housing funding from a timing perspective. And this gives us the opportunity to really build that in and have a program that can do all of these things. Right now, HUD has put out the regulations for that. States are in the process of doing their plans for home ARP. This funding is going to go to support households that are homeless, who are at risk of homelessness, that need services, that are fleeing domestic violence or human trafficking, or are veterans. And that is a really exciting new program that we're all in the process of right now. Other things that are going on in IRS, wow, there's a lot of regulatory issues happening. So first of all, we just got out guidance from IRS on the implementation of the 4% minimum rate, answering some questions about when bonds were used as drawdown bonds, if the issue was actually issued in 2020, whether or not drawdown bonds in 2021 would allow for the 4% minimum rate to apply. The answer is no. But also, if you get two different bond issuances, one in 2020 and one in 2021, what is the criteria for that 4% minimum rate? And the answer is that 2021 bond issuance must be at least 10% in order to be considered not de minimis. So that just happened. We are waiting on Treasury and IRS for guidance around the average income test still. We are also waiting on Treasury and the IRS for guidance around COVID, because we are coming close to the end of the year, and that means properties are hitting up against placed in service deadlines. Housing credit properties are hitting up against placed in service deadlines, and that's a real concern because we know that there have been many delays this year because of supply chain issues, because of worker shortages, and we have been really encouraging IRS to get guidance out there that would extend some of these deadlines, including the placed in service deadline. It hasn't happened yet. Fingers crossed, we keep pushing for it. And I think that those are the main things I wanted to cover. Emily, did I miss anything there?
No, I think you got it. The only other regulatory issue we wanted to touch on was CRA reform. So I wanted to turn it over to Shannon for the latest there, and any other last administration issues that you want to flag.
No, I think CRA reform is the top one. We're still waiting for it, but the big news there is that the president's nominee to be comptroller of the currency withdrew her name yesterday. So I think we expect, although, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, as someone said earlier, but I think we expect that formal rulemaking won't take place until a permanent comptroller is in place. They're behind the scenes. I know a lot of groups are working on kind of preparation for what we would like to see in a modernized CRA reg, but that's something to watch. There's also just a lot of other nominees that are still winding their way through the Senate. I know there's like 5 or 6 HUD ones, or some from Treasury. So other things to watch as the Biden administration officials get into place, and rulemaking might ramp up a little bit from what we've seen now.
Great. Well, go ahead, Jennifer.
I just want to add one other thing that NCSHA is working on that we would invite everyone else to help us with, and that is, there were other resources that were passed as part of the American Rescue Plan Act in what's called the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And these are pretty flexible. Well, they're intended to be flexible resources for states and localities. And somewhere about half of the states have actually put this towards affordable housing, or want to put it towards affordable housing. And in particular as a gap filler resource with housing credit deals, because we know that costs have increased so substantially during the pandemic for so many reasons. We really need to be able to use this money to fill those gaps. And unfortunately, the way that the Treasury FAQs currently read, it makes that pretty difficult. And so we're doing some work right now with Treasury trying to make that easier. But this is a huge resource that we really feel is absolutely what Congress intended for these kinds of funds, and something that we'd really like to be able to better use with the housing credit program. So I'll leave it at that. And if people have questions about that, I can address it afterwards.
Great. Well, those were all the questions I had. So thank you all for running through those. If people from the audience have questions, we've got a few minutes. I know a couple of our panelists have to drop in 5, but we can take any last questions. Otherwise, I have one last question. And I also just wanted to comment while you're thinking about if you have questions on Shannon's update on CRA reform. I know that the second most common question I get, the first, of course, being is Build Back Better going to pass? Is LIHTC going to be in it? The other common question is just, what is that going to mean for the housing credit market? And CRA reform is one of the things I really point to as, we're going to have to wait and see how the dust settles with all the new credits and, how does this minimum book tax affect appetite and all these things. But CRA is one area where I think there's a lot of influence we could have with a very pro-affordable housing administration to try to make sure it at least maintains or hopefully increases demand for affordable housing, and to keep an eye on FHFA as well, because they have already lifted the caps on Fannie and Freddie's investments in the credit, and I know they've been checking in with us and others in the affordable housing industry frequently to see what levers they may need to pull. So just a couple other administration issues. So, all right, seeing no other questions, one final question before we let you go is, if Build Back Better passes in the next, let's say before the end of the year, what do you think you're going to be spending most of next year working on? So let's start with you, Margaret.
That's a good question. Honestly, I'm going to be working on CDBG DR funds that we received and the homeowner assistance fund. And apparently we got weatherization money that I still didn't even know we had. So I'll be busy with that. But I think that we'll be immediately trying to, rethink our LIHTC program. I think we have a real opportunity if we have those reforms and the reforms to the bond test that we've talked about, to advance our racial equity work that we're doing with our QAP, with our 9% program, and then really think creatively about how to stretch those 4% resources. So that'll be, I think, the most fun thing that we'll get to work on next year.
Great. What about you, Shannon?
Well, generally implementation, which is an interesting answer, so I won't give you that. But I do think this is a question we're all going to have to grapple with, and we've started among our members of what's most important. Like, you can't do 1,000 things at once, right? Margaret mentioned there's money that's still moving now and looking ahead. I know historically we're going to be really interested in the Housing Investment Fund, Capital Magnet Fund 2.0 thing, just because we, our members benefit from the competitively awarded grant application, and it's open to nonprofits as well as CDFI, so really fits our membership well. Also the neighborhood homes implementation, all of the new programs, I think, that don't have established coalitions around them. I think really making sure we're plugging in practitioners to the right people there to get that done. So we'll see, but it'd be a great problem to have. Yes, and CDFI FA grants were just announced today. That is right. I saw that. I haven't had a chance to actually look through, although hopefully a lot of HPM members in there. Sure there are.
Great. And Jennifer, what will you be doing with all of your newfound free time?
So first of all, I think there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done on the extremely low income piece of the housing credit provisions that I will tell you, I am concerned. It is super complicated, and I am hopeful that we'll be able to really implement this, but we're probably going to need to do a lot of work with IRS on it. So there's that piece. I will probably also be spending a lot of time on neighborhood homes because, it's really interesting because it's a home ownership program, and yet it's so different from what the homeownership side of, the people who work on homeownership within housing finance agencies, it's a completely different thing. And so I think we're going to be thinking a lot about how we figure this out with staffing, because it's really more similar to the housing credit world. And from a staffing perspective, both for housing finance agencies and CSHA, I think it's the housing credit people who will be involved to a large extent in standing this up. So those two things. I also don't want to forget the other provisions that are housing credit provisions in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. We have a lot of other things that are still on our agenda for the housing credit program that aren't as big as far as new investments, but are really important for making that program work as smoothly as possible. And I don't want to leave those out at all. It's not like if we get this, we are done with the housing credit for a while. We still have things we need to do. And then lastly, we have been working with a senator's office on legislation to reauthorize the home program and make some really important changes to that program that I am super excited about. So I am hopeful that that will be a whole new thing for me.
Great. Well, thank you all. And I know Shannon and Margaret had to drop, so please join me in thanking them. And thank you, Jennifer. This has been a really fun conversation during this crazy week. And I want to thank Sadie and the WAHN team for putting this together and bringing this group together, and excited to be part of the group as it grows. So I'll turn it back over to you, Sadie, for any, or Millie, for any last closing words.
I don't have too much to say. As always, that was super educational. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, Jennifer. And we're looking forward to our next panel. Look out for something in the first quarter. Millie, anything that you want to add?
I would just, continue to thank our sponsors of the Women's Affordable Housing Network as well. And of course, the leadership of Emily on this policy subcommittee. And so, yeah, looking forward to, it sounds like there's more to be talk about and to be done. So looking forward to future conversations. So thanks a lot.
It'll certainly be interesting to see where we are next quarter. So looking forward to it, and thank you all.
Stay tuned.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.